History as it happens, March 29th, 2022. Democracies and Dictatorships.
Battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force.
This is the 1930s all over again. What Putin did yesterday was tear up an agreement made 25 years ago. That's exactly what Hitler did.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
The United States, the West, NATO are united, at least for now, in opposing Russia's war by imposing sanctions and funneling arms to the Ukrainians. It's an open question on whether those measures will work, and if they don't, what the West could or should do next. The Biden administration wants to show strength, lest it get accused of treating Putin as Europe appeased Hitler. But meandering through the 1930s looking for parallels can confuse as much as clarify. That's next when we speak to Ian Kershaw as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We have a sacred obligation under Article 5 to defend each and every inch of NATO territory.
This act marks the end of the old Soviet Union, signified today by Mikhail Gorbachev's decision to resign as president.
Russia is not the enemy of the United States. As a matter of fact, after our meeting today, I'm convinced it can be a strong partner and friend.
A contentious relationship with Russia is not in America's interest.
We'll continue to make clear to Russia that further provocations will achieve nothing except to further isolate Russia and diminish its place in the world.
It's like facing up to gangsters, isn't it, with bare fists.
South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham says if Vladimir Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, then we can expect dictators elsewhere to act the same.
If we allow Russia to get away with destroying the Ukraine, it's just a matter of time till China takes over Taiwan.
In his remarks to reporters, Graham used the A word.
What Putin did yesterday was tear up an agreement made 25 years ago. That's exactly what Hitler did in the 30s. And the response to Hitler was one appeasement after another.
Now, my mind also reached back to the 1930s, and maybe yours did too, after Russia began its unprovoked war against its neighbor. It's hard to resist searching the past for parallels to help us understand what's going on now. After all, this is Europe we're talking about. Its first attempt at a League of Nations to stop aggression failed terribly in the face of Mussolini and Hitler.
Frieden wollen wir, aber diese ununterbrochene Entrückung lehnen wir ab.
But Europe was a brittle continent in the 1930s, still struggling to recover from the First World War. The U.S. was not a member of the League. There was no NATO or EU. There were no nuclear weapons serving as a deterrent to all-out war. And Vladimir Putin is not Hitler. And there was no Munich Conference that agreed to let Russia carve up Ukraine. But that didn't stop some American politicians from invoking the A word, appeasement, as Senator Joni Ernst did on ABC's This Week.
So far with this administration, we have seen a doctrine of appeasement, and that certainly is not going to deter President Putin and Russia from invading Ukraine.
Well, the U.S. and NATO's response has been anything but appeasement. Still, it's not clear sanctions against Russia and military assistance for Ukraine will be enough. And this may be one place where comparisons with the past work, and that is the inherent weaknesses of democracies when facing up to the threats of dictatorships.
I mean, you could say, why didn't the West intervene when the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014? But wasn't that a little bit like the Rhineland in 1936?
We're delighted to have historian Ian Kershaw back on the podcast. Our conversation with the acclaimed biographer of Hitler and chronicler of 20th century Europe is coming up in a moment. So I repeat, Putin is not Hitler, but that does not mean we can't learn something from the comparison, and that is the extent to which Hitler's ideological motivations were underestimated by the Western democracies in the 1930s. It is now clear, if it weren't already, that Vladimir Putin isn't motivated merely by money and power. He also subscribes to an ultra-nationalist interpretation of history where Ukraine is not a separate nation, Ukrainian is not a language. He repeated these ideas, if you will, in his hour-long speech the day before ordering the invasion in late February. He said, "I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik Communist Russia. This process started practically right after the 1917 revolution, and Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia." You can find this rambling monologue on YouTube. You might think it is crazy, but we should take people at their word. Putin is trying to rewrite history to restore Russian domination of Ukraine. It may sound weirdly abstract to discuss such ideas when bombs are falling on real people, but ideas matter. So let's talk about it now with one of my favorite historians, Sir Ian Kershaw. Welcome back to the podcast.
Very nice to be back with you.
So before we get to any parallels with the past, I am curious to learn what you've been thinking as you've been watching this war unfold in Eastern Europe. Sir Anthony Beaver was recently on the podcast, and he said he did not expect Putin would actually go through with it. What's been on your mind?
Well, I took a very different view to Anthony on that. I thought he would invade. My wife, who thought he would not, it was all a bluff and it was all to pressurize the West. And several of my friends thought the same. But I took the view all the time that he would invade. I thought that the build-up to it, you get 150,000 men around the borders of Ukraine. It's very difficult to get 150,000 men in place and then just have them stand down again without any loss of face. I thought loss of face was a crucial thing for Putin. And I thought then that the demands of the West and of the Russians were incompatible, and therefore there was no way of reconciling them. It didn't prevent my shock, of course, when it did take place, and my absolute sense of despair and horror and depression has been taking place since.
That part of Europe, of course, has a deep history of terrible warfare, genocide. To some, that history might seem irrelevant to the dispute today, but it's certainly not irrelevant to Vladimir Putin. He invokes history all the time, often a distorted version of it, wouldn't you say?
It's a completely distorted version of it, but he does, and he's not alone in that, in looking back not just to the short-term Russian past and the past since the end of the Soviet Union, that's a crucial part of the story, but far beyond that, I think, back to even to the 18th century, Russia already laid claim to substantial parts of Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, we speak of it now as a country that's existed since 1991, but the boundaries were very fluid all the time. The Ukrainians lived under different regimes, under Russian tutelage, under the Austrians, under the Poles, under Lithuanians, and so on. So it's not been a stable country in the slightest, and even its last 30 years have been rocky in parts. But I think Putin looks back to that. So I think you have to see him as a Russian nationalist who looks back and wants to recapture Russia's greatness, which was destroyed in his view, of course, as part of the destruction of the Soviet Union in 1991.
And he says Lenin made a mistake by acknowledging the Ukrainian nationality, if you will, in 1922 by creating a Ukraine SSR. Trying to determine what's going on in the Kremlin today that's beyond my grasp. I can't say what's happening there. And that makes it difficult, of course, to discern what Putin's motives are. But it seems he wants to create a puppet government, install a puppet regime in Kyiv, and simply dominate Ukraine that way. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think he wants to create Greater Russia, really, which included, in his view, Ukraine as part of that. As I said, going right back to even to the 17th century, when the suzerainty of the Duchy of Muscovy was accepted by the Cossacks in what's now southern Ukraine, right through to Peter the Great in the early 18th century, especially Catherine the Great in the later 18th century. There's been Russian claim to dominance over Ukraine and the view that Ukraine is a part of this Greater Russia and subordinate to it. And I think my own guess is that Putin started off by wanting to re-establish Greater Russia. He's miscalculated grievously, of course. So it may be in the end that a peace settlement, when it comes, whatever it looks like, will have to accept a reduced claim to lands in Russia, and Putin may now be reducing his claims to that strip along the southern part of Ukraine, linking up perhaps Odessa in the west, Crimea, Mariupol, which has been so ruined, and through to the Donbass area, which the Russians are already in possession of. So it may be that that will be the territorial remnant that he will cling to and try to sell it as a victory in Russia. It will be at the best a Pyrrhic victory, of course.
When I tried to make sense of what was happening, I thought of the 1930s, which can be problematic, as we know. I did not think of Germany and Hitler. I thought of the League of Nations and the Italian attack on Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia. Because at the time, and of course there are major differences between the world order of the 1930s and the one we're dealing with now, but at the time, Italy's aggression posed some really serious challenges to what you might have called the West. But the League of Nations, of course, was not anywhere near as strong as NATO, right? And at the time, Britain and France could not get their acts together when it comes to sanctions, possible military intervention, and the League of Nations crumbled as a result. Is that correct, Sir Ian, when it comes to Ethiopia?
Yes, it's absolutely correct. And of course, not only did France and Britain, which were the two countries that counted at that time in the League of Nations, the USA, of course, didn't join it. So it was France and Britain who were the two major powers. And not only did they do little to prevent that, the sanctions were very ineffective. They were nowhere near like the sanctions we have today imposed on Russia. And the sanctions were ineffective, but also they came round to doing a deal with Italy, which basically rewarded Italy for its aggression against another League of Nations country. But the League of Nations was already showing itself to be weakened even before Ethiopia. But from then on, it was a busted flush completely. Britain and France had covered themselves in ignominy in doing the deal with Mussolini's Italy to reward it for its aggression.
And in the mid-1930s, there was not an atmosphere of cooperation in Europe at all. There were financial, economic problems in addition to these military issues.
I know we're now looking for historical parallels with what went on, but actually the parallels are at the best very faint ones, because the entire situation is now totally different from what it was in the 1930s in geopolitical terms. And of course, we were not dealing then with nuclear powers. The parallels or analogies or whatever you want to call them, it's worth looking back at them, but mainly to point up the differences rather than the similarities of what's going on now.
Because when I was thinking of that example, it was in the context of Putin is trying to basically roll back the clock to a time where strong powers could absorb their weaker neighbors. And of course, in the 1930s, the League of Nations was incapable of doing something about that when it came to a number of issues, right? It was Japan in Manchuria, Italy in Ethiopia, and then, of course, Hitler's revisionism with the reoccupation of the Rhineland, etc. But today, some might look at those past examples and say, we have to be really tough on Putin. We cannot allow him an off-ramp, if you will, because that would, in effect, reward him for invading Ukraine by giving him something in return for ending the war. You see where I'm getting at?
I see what you're getting at, but I have some difficulty in trying to relate the problems that we have now to the problems of the past. I mean, the imperialism of Mussolini and Hitler is very different from the imperialism of Putin, for example, leaving aside the very big issue, the fact that Putin presides over a nuclear arsenal. So when you say we need to be tough with Putin's Russia, there are limits to our toughness without provoking the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe, not just for Russia, but for the entire world. Looking at your historical analogy as it was, though, we have to say that Mussolini's imperialism was absolutely simply that, wasn't it? That he was invading Ethiopia, a long way from Italy. It wasn't Italy's neighbor and so on. Yeah. Now, what Putin is doing in his own eyes, and we have to try to see it whilst deploring what's gone on, we won't get anywhere near understanding it if we don't try to grasp what it looks like from the Russian side. And from the Russian side, it's a grasp of territory. There's a grasp of territory for what it sees as historic reasons, that Ukraine in this distorted view of history, belongs to Russia, is not a separate nation, as Putin said, an artificial nation in his view, and so on. Preventing Ukraine from belonging to NATO and moving into the orbit of the West is a crucial part of Russia's prevention of hostility from the West towards Russia. We might think this is absurd, and much of it is absurd, but Russia has been invaded several times from the West. And from their point of view, there's a paranoia about that happening now. And when you look at the map with the NATO bases around Russia and with missiles pointing at Russia, then it is at least understandable from their point of view why they have some fear of what the West stands for. I think if you couple that with Russian nationalism, greater Russian nationalism, then you're looking to a type of ideology that fits in with the demand for land to bolster Russia's defensive position vis-a-vis the West. And incidentally, I just have one other point. We talk all the time about Putin as if it's a complete one-man show, but I think he's the head of an organization, of a system, the Putin Syndicate. And that is actually the security services, the intelligence services, and the upper echelons of the armed forces, no doubt, which actually support this. Putin unquestionably takes the key decisions, but he's part of a system. That's the point I'm just making here. It's not just a one-man show, a dictator acting on his own against all the advice he's been given and so on. So with those in mind, I think we can differentiate it from the aggression that you see from Mussolini and also from Hitler in the 1930s.
I think you're right. And all Russian leaders going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union opposed NATO enlargement. That has been an issue now running for 30 years.
Except that, of course, in the early 1990s, Yeltsin was even interested in Russia joining NATO. So there was a time there where the Russians wanted a new security organization for the whole of Europe, which would have included Russia. Now, that was not feasible. We just need to pose the question to ask what sort of organization NATO would have been with Russia part of it. You can see from that, then, there was a big worry about what the situation was going to be with regard to security after that. And of course, soon afterwards, then that non-starter of an idea was dropped completely. And from then on, we start seeing other countries then wanting to belong to NATO. So NATO is not just pushing for its expansion, it's actually meeting the requests of these countries. And we can also think, isn't it a good thing for these countries like Poland and Lithuania and so on? Unlike Ukraine, they are parts of NATO.
Key figures within the Clinton administration decided that Russia, despite the talk of having Russia potentially join some Western military alliance, those key figures decided, and then Bill Clinton decided as well, that Russia would not be integrated with the West in that manner. What about this issue of ethnic nationalism? So often, at least in the United States, the clash we're witnessing right now is framed as democracies versus autocracies. But I think one parallel that works is, and Putin often says this, he is there to help the Russians within Ukraine who he says, and it's a preposterous claim, of course, that they were being persecuted. Russians were a persecuted minority in Ukraine.
That is a very good point. I think Putin's claims are preposterous, as you say. There is a big Russian sector to the population in Ukraine and an even bigger part of the population that speaks Russian as well as Ukrainian. Of course, the Russians themselves, Russian nationalists, would dispute that Ukrainian is a separate language. They claim that it's more or less not much more than a dialect of Russian. That's untrue as well. It is a separate language. And the Ukrainians have their own culture, which is developed separately from that of Russia. But the Russians have this sense of ethnic nationalism, that Ukraine is a part of them, and the Ukrainians are their cousins, or at the very least, and they should be incorporated as a part of an expanded Russia, of greater Russia. That is an element of comparison with the 1930s. But of course, the ethnic nationalism of the 1930s went much farther than just trying to incorporate, in Hitler's case, for example, in trying to incorporate the Sudeten Germans or something. That was, for him, a facade to open up a much greater imperialist war, which would have extended German domination throughout Europe. So the ethnic nationalism is I think, a correct point to make, but it only goes so far in the comparison as well.
Well, when it comes to more recent history, one of my recent guests, Mary Elise Sarati, who wrote a great book about the post-Cold War period titled Not 1 Inch, she raised this idea being developed by scholars that we're now witnessing the wars of Soviet succession. The end of the USSR was not a single event, it was an ongoing process. So the argument goes, even if there were no NATO enlargement, Russia would still be trying to restore its old empire. Do you buy that?
Yes, I think that lost empire is the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Empire, though. If I can differentiate there, I think even Putin recognizes that without inciting a clash with NATO countries and the possibility, even the probability of nuclear war, he can't go around annexing all the areas which in the meanwhile have joined NATO and so on. So the Baltic states, the fear of Russia is very understandable. But I think it's unlikely that Putin will strike out to try to take Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, because that would then risk this clash with the West, nuclear clash possibly. But those were part of the Soviet Union. His aim is actually to head off any inroads in what could be seen as Russia's sphere of influence or sphere of power. So when Georgia flirted with the idea of belonging to NATO and so on in 2008, I think it was, the Russian intervention there took place. And Ukraine is the part of Europe which is, from a Russian perspective, I think, is the closest to Russia, belongs to Russia in their eyes. And so I think what you're getting is actually to head off any inroads into what would be a reconstitution of the Russian Empire. You can see, looking back on it, so I'm no expert on Putin or the Ukraine, but I think looking back on it, you can probably see how Putin himself becomes increasingly converted into an outright nationalist, along with many others who look at Ukraine in this way from about maybe 2004 or so onwards.
That's why Ukraine has always had a special place in this equation when it comes to the NATO enlargement. Right after 1991, there was discussion within Ukraine about joining NATO. You referenced earlier, even in Russia, there was talk of joining NATO. But in 2008, that was a key year because that's when, at the Bucharest Conference, the West and NATO announced without consulting the Russians that Ukraine and Georgia would be promised at some vague future date NATO membership. Of course, that never happened, so Ukraine got the worst of both worlds, right? They were given a promise that never came to fruition, and they were left on the wrong side of Europe's new dividing line. And that's a problem here, too. I think some leaders hope that by this point in history, we would have gotten past bloc politics. We would have solved the problem of the era of the nation state, but I guess not.
Well, I think we probably need to explore a lot more carefully. I don't just mean you and me now, because I know too little about it, but what needs to be done is to explore more carefully, I think, the early years of the 1990s, when probably mistakes were made there in the way that the West dealt with Yeltsin's Russia. It played its own part in a way in helping this complete grasp of vast amounts of state property at knockdown prices, which took place there, converting it into basically a criminal state. And the result of that was essentially the elevation of Putin, the making of Putin as a manufactured product, I think, initially, by groups within the KGB, of which he himself was a product, of course, within the KGB, to put him on in the presidency to replace Yeltsin and try to restore some of Russia's greatness. And there's nothing so worrying as a great power, in this case a superpower, that's been humiliated. And that's what Russia was in the 1990s, a humiliated superpower. And Putin, I think, set out initially very cautiously to restore some of that lost power and lost credibility to Russia.
And the war in Chechnya in 94, and then it was renewed in 99, scared countries that used to be in the Soviet bloc. I'm talking about Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. They all joined NATO in 1999, but the first Chechen war in 94 was a key turning point. I mentioned this idea before that regardless NATO, there is an argument out there that Russia was going to be a problem after this period of time.
Yes, I think even before then, but certainly after that, And I think in the West, we were too self-congratulatory after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, and we thought that Russia would turn into a Western-style liberal democracy, and under Yeltsin, it turned into this kleptocracy, which basically destroyed the country, destroyed the economy, and handed it over to some robber barons. The problems of the 1990s came back to haunt us in a big way, but I think it wasn't just the countries of Central Europe, which were and the Baltic countries, very understandably extremely concerned about what Putin and that regime was capable of doing subsequently, as you say, by 2008 at the latest. But already before, there were worrying signs, weren't there? You can think of Ukraine in 2004 already, where the Orange Revolution took place then. Already you see Ukraine veering between looking towards the West and looking towards Russia and so on. That became heightened then later on. You can see, I think, looking back, how what happened in Ukraine now has a trajectory that runs right back to the early 1990s.
Invariably in the United States, when something like this happens, you'll hear politicians say, we need to get tough on Russia because otherwise we will be appeasing the Russians. And that, of course, invokes the 1930s.
So far with this administration, we have seen a doctrine of appeasement, and that certainly is not going to deter President Putin and Russia.
I think we agree that those comparisons aren't sound. However, there is this issue of inherent weaknesses in democracies standing up to autocracies or aggressive powers. It's difficult to do that, right?
Exceedingly. I mean, we have now really taken a pretty tough stance economically with Russia. We've also, of course, provided Ukraine with military assistance. We've resisted, quite correctly, in my view, no-fly zone over Ukraine. That would open up the possibility of a nuclear war. But we've been pretty tough economically. These are the toughest sanctions that have ever been imposed anywhere, I think. Sanctions don't tend to bring down regimes. Certainly that's a historical message from them. Pretty tough sanctions in Iran, but what they've done is consolidated the Iranian regime rather than destroy it. So what these sanctions will do in Russia over time, who knows? They may well start to disconnect parts of that Russian elite from Putin. We hope that will be the case. It needs a systemic change, not just removal of Putin, really. But your big question is really whether the Western liberal democracies are ever able to stand up to dictators. I mean, it is a question of, by the time that we see the full weight of what their aggression comes down to, it's already too late. I mean, you could say, why didn't the West intervene when the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014? But wasn't that a little bit like the Rhineland in 1936? Until 1954, from 1783 to 1954, Crimea being part of the Russian Empire. It was then given over by Khrushchev, as we know, to Ukraine
as a gift
to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the first, I think in 1654, the first recognition by the Cossacks of Moscow's suzerainty. But anyway, the issue there is, should the West then have intervened really strongly in 2014? Yes, it should in retrospect.
Yeah.
But you're dealing with then a very small issue that didn't seem to concern us very greatly. And so there's a reluctance to do very much, to go in for massive sanctions, which, to make another point about it then, would be damaging to the countries that were imposing the sanctions, as these sanctions now are. So all these countries have their own vested interests. Germany, for example, and its dependence on gas and oil from Russia. The business that's been done with Russia, the business that Great Britain has done with Russia, and the half of London bought up by Russian oligarchs and so on. The amount of money that's flowing into Russia all the time. So taking a tough stance is easy to say, very hard to do. And if you're going from a liberal democratic point of view, then taking a tough stance is particularly difficult, because it's like facing up to gangsters, isn't it, with bare fists.
I know the 1930s and the League of Nations don't provide the best parallels here, but I think the issue does obtain. You need public opinion on your side. And if it comes to the potential for military intervention to stop an aggressor, that's difficult to mobilize public opinion and your militaries, because once you cross that line, right, there really isn't any going back. And the Western democracies are trying to avoid war. right? They're actually not trying
Exactly. And that's a key thing, isn't it? That appeasement is now seen as a dirty word. But in the 1930s, appeasement was popular down to the Munich Agreement of 1938, actually even beyond that. But down to then, people wanted disarmament. They wanted to appease. They didn't want war again. They'd fought the First World War only 20 years earlier. They didn't want a repeat of that. But they were dealing then with an outright gangster in Berlin, in Hitler, and another one, a lesser gangster in Rome with Mussolini. And up against that, then this fear of war, the fact that these democracies, Western democracies, are innately peace-loving. They want actually a quiet life. And when you're getting somebody who disturbs that peace and disturbs it with very massive aggression, it's quite hard to whip up then the determination to confront them. It took a lot of doing in the West then in 1939 to get to that position.
And in the event, Britain and France really couldn't do much for Poland anyway after giving Poland the guarantee.
Nothing whatsoever.
And we should also note that Hitler saw the 1938 Munich Agreement as a loss because it robbed him of the war he wanted. Back to present day, Sir Ian, Stephen Erlanger, writing in the New York Times recently, cited some Russian ideologues. It helped me make sense of what is going on now. One was Ivan Ilyin, who was born in 1883. He saw salvation in a totalitarian state led by a righteous individual. And another major influence on Putin's thinking is Alexander Dugin. He advanced the notion to promote an ultra-nationalist view of Russia's destiny as a conservative empire in perpetual conflict with the liberal Western world. It seems to make more sense now, what we're looking at, as horrible as it is, trying to, again, discern what Putin's motives are and how this might end.
Yes, I agree with you on that. That's what I was saying earlier on, that I think Putin bought into this nationalist ideology, ethnic nationalist ideology, if you like, which Ukraine figures very prominently. I don't know the figures you're talking about there, but I think there are a number of writers and thinkers in Russia before Putin got on board with all this, who've been very influential in the nationalist wing of political thinking in Russia. That nationalist thinking has now occupied the major echelons of power in that state.
I had not heard of these figures either. Again, reading from the New York Times article, Mr. Dugin said back in 2014, only after restoring the greater Russia, that is the Eurasian Union, we can become a credible global player. So it puts into perspective some of the explanations we're hearing. It's about NATO expansion. It's about democracy on Russia's border. I think it's multi-determined, right? There are lots of different layers to this.
That's exactly right.
Wars are fought on the ground. They're not abstractions. But these ideas do make a difference.
They're crucial, not just justification or legitimation, but motivation. I think everybody in the 1930s, if you want to go back to there for one more time, everybody underestimated Hitler's ideological motivation. And now there's a way in which people are underestimating the ideas that Putin has, because what we see is just the daily horror of Mariupol and other cities, and we see the land grab and the rest of it. And we think those ideas are just a legitimation, but they could well be, and I think they are, a powerful motivation for what is happening there. Dugin, incidentally, I had heard of, and I read a book not too long ago which was talking about Russian nationalism, and Dugin figured in there, and I thought then how close those ideas were to the ideas which Putin is now coming to represent, I think. So I would place a considerable store on the importance of ideological motivation. And as you say, that does seem to make some sense from a Russian perspective as to what's happening. And I've always disliked the notion that Putin is simply a madman. It's a madness of a system, but it's not the insanity in any clinical sense of an individual that we're looking at.
Even though there are, of course, dramatic differences between Putin and a figure such as Hitler, I would suggest to all of our listeners that they should read your works on the Hitler dictatorship to understand how these systems work. It's not just one individual or even a group of individuals. There is a system at work. Wrapping up, Sir Ian, I think some commentators in the West are getting a little ahead of themselves by saying Ukraine is winning or will prevail. Max Hastings said on my podcast recently that he believes this is going to take a long time, and he says we should not underestimate Russia's willingness to brutalize Ukraine into submission. Where do you think this might go?
I agree in good part with Max Hastings. I don't think it will, however, develop into that lengthy a war. The level of violence that we're seeing is such that I think it will result in the not too distant future, in the foreseeable future, in some form of, I hate to say peace settlement, it won't be peace by any normal standards, but some sort of end to this aggression. And I think you're right to say that many people in the West are over-optimistic about what is going to come out of this. My own guess is that after a lengthy attritional struggle, unfortunately, Russia will succeed, at least in part, in imposing a form of settlement on Ukraine, which may well bring about the acceptance of the barrel of a gun that the southern strip that I mentioned earlier on, including Donbass, Crimea and so on, will belong to Russia. It will be a Pyrrhic victory for Putin. He's gravely miscalculated. The possibility of holding down a country through brute force, a country of that size, which is so heroically fighting and will continue in the underground to fight, that's an impossibility, I think, for Russia. So I think there will be a settlement in due course, but it will be a brutal settlement, and it will be only a partial victory for Putin, let's say a Pyrrhic victory, which may well suffice for the time being to buy off discontent in Russia, but in the long run will actually, shall we, start to pave the way for Putin's own retreat from power, his own demise as a political figure. The problem then will be, is it just Putin that goes, or is it a system with Putin that goes? That's the key question for me.
He did badly miscalculate. This is a misadventure of epic proportions that is still, of course, subjecting Ukraine to terrible suffering and brutality. We know that wars don't really end. They migrate to our minds, and this one's going to have ripple effects. I mean, one can understand why Ukrainians want to resist. They do not want to live under Russian domination with a puppet regime in Kyiv. On the other hand, you look at the possibility of urban combat, house-to-house, street-by-street fighting in Kyiv.
I think and hope it won't get to that.
Sir Ian Kershaw, you're always welcome on the podcast, and we look forward to your upcoming book later this year, titled Personality and Power, Builders and Destroyers of Modern Europe. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Supreme Court confirmation hearings are supposed to be serious affairs, but they've turned into risible political theater, abasing the highest court in the land, from Bork to Brown-Jackson. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.